Sure, go ahead.
So we're about to hear Being More or Less Democratic, Measuring Democratic Tendencies. And this is John Flanagan. Uh, John is a professor of government and history at Weatherford College. He is incredibly knowledgeable and entertaining, and I know we're all going to enjoy this. Take it away, John.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for coming by on Zoom. I know it's unusual. Well, maybe it's not unusual since we've been doing it for a year and a half now. But today what we're going to do is we're going to be looking at questions about democracy. And actually, I'm doing two presentations. This is my first presentation, which is on democracy. And then a little bit later, I'm doing one on non-democratic governments. But I think democracy is a good place to start. Again, democracy is very important to us. We like to think we live in a democracy, and valuing democracy is something that I think is important to us, not just in an academic sense, but in a real sense too, in a practical sense. So we're going to spend some time, like I said today, kind of looking at understanding democracy. And the first thing I think that's important to say here is in today's world, everybody wants to be a democracy. Now, again, making the claim that you're a democracy and actually being a democracy are two very different things. Let me give you an example here. If I can move this along. So here we have two countries, North Korea and Denmark. Now, North Korea, official name is the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, right? But we just call it North Korea. Now, from the name, it would seem that North Korea is democratic. There are very few people in the world, unless you're in North Korea, that would probably make the claim that North Korea is very democratic. Of course, there we have a picture of one of the large public rituals, the notorious military parades in North Korea. And then on the other side of that, we have Denmark. Right? Denmark is also a democracy. And when people look at a place like Denmark, and again, there are scholars, a lot of political scientists and other scholars who look at countries and try and figure out just kind of how democratic they are. And Denmark is always very high up there. It's usually like in the top three. Actually, many of the Nordic countries are actually Denmark, Norway, always are kind of in that kind of upper echelon. So, of course, the question then is how can we make a claim that North Korea and Denmark are the same? Because they're not. Not to kill the suspense or anything, but they're not, right? So that's where we have to start. And it turns out that being a democracy and being democratic is actually a very dynamic thing. It is possible to have very strong democratic tendencies. It's possible to have weak democratic tendencies. It's interesting. When I was looking at some of the research, getting ready for this, I was looking at there's a organization called Freedom House, and they are an organization that rates democracies. They have their own kind of scale, and they look at democracies, and when they issue a report every year, and they basically say these are non-democratic countries, and these are sort of democratic countries, and these are full democracies. And it was interesting, when you look at the Freedom House rankings or any other of the organizations that do that kind of thing, and there are a couple out there. You always have this kind of sort of democracy category, and it's really quite large. In the Freedom House rankings, like 45% of the nations in the world are sort of democracies. Actually, it's democracy of some kind. Only like 5%, a little bit under 5%, are actually full democracies. So what that means is there's room there. There's variation there, and we need to kind of look at that variation and understand it. Now, again, let me just stop sharing there. Okay. I think one of the things that I think is important is to understand democracy, and this is how I look at it. Again, it's not just me; other people do as well. But I found this to be a really helpful way of thinking about democracy, and that is to think of democracy as an ideal, right? It is an ideal that we are trying to achieve. And so we're striving to achieve that ideal. Now, again, like most ideals, it might not be possible to actually attain that state of perfection, right? But we still strive for it. I think a good analogy that I always use is the idea of perfect health, right? So you can think of it as, think to yourself, like, what would it mean to be in perfect health? So kind of get that idea in your mind. What would that look like? How would we get there, right? Now, again, we know what perfect health would not be, right? You'd be dead, right? So there's definitely a bright line there that will determine what it's not, right? But then there's all this possibility of what it could be. So, what would it mean to be like in perfect health? Like in my mind, it's like an Arnold Schwarzenegger or something, and we might be able to define what that would be, in terms of perfect health. If you went to a doctor and you said, what would it mean to be in perfect health? They could probably give you a good idea, right? In a clinical sense, they could say, well, your blood pressure would be between this range, and your blood sugar would be this, and your percent body fat would be that, right? So in a clinical sense, we can understand the concept, right? But again, since we're dealing with a issue about about what society would be like, because we're talking about government democracy, right? It would be important then to ask yourself, well, even though I might be able to define it in a clinical sense, what would that mean in a practical sense? Kind of going back to that idea of perfect health, right? If I wanted to achieve that goal, what would my life look like? What would I have to do? More importantly, what would I have to give up? What would I have to sacrifice in order to get to that place? And that would be, important. You can see I am not in perfect health by far. But what would that mean? I mean, would I have to go to the gym several hours a day? Probably wouldn't eat a lot of tacos and pizza. Probably some protein gruel or something like that. So if I did all those things, if I strove to get there, I might not want to be that way, right? This is the reason why people aren't in perfect health. It can be difficult, and you have to give up a lot for that. So that kind of becomes our question. Now, again, here's the thing, right? Even though we may never attain the goal, right? And we're never going to attain that ideal, it doesn't mean that striving for it's a bad thing, right? I still like to, go out and exercise, 3 or 4 times a week. And I watch my diet and I make sure I don't eat certain things. So even though we might not attain that ideal, in striving for it, there is great merit, right? And there's value in doing that. And the same is true with democracy, right? We may never get to a point where we are a perfect democracy. In fact, I don't even know if I could describe what a perfect democracy would look like. But again, trying to get there, striving to get there, can be very important. And there is great value in that. So there's that. Now, another issue with democracy is there's really no exacting definition of what a democracy would look like. Now, again, there are certain elements that every democracy must have, right? And there are certain principles that every democracy must follow, right? But as to, how you set up your government, what kind of institutions you have, the different forms they can take, there are plenty of different mixes for that. So there's not a perfect formula, a perfect recipe, kind of like pies. Give you a good example, right? There are a lot of different kind of pies out there, right? But if I look at something, I can say, well, that's pie. Now it might be an apple pie, it might be a chocolate pie, it might be a cherry pie, but I know what a pie is, right? But there are many different kinds out there, and democracy is kind of the same thing, right? We know the basic ideas behind a democracy, right? Collective decision making, right, by individuals, but at the same time, there are different forms. Again, when you look just very basically at democracies, you have an American system, which is a congressional presidential system, but you also have parliamentary systems, right? And in terms of institutions and how those institutions work, they are different from each other. But we would claim that both of those are democratic. So we have to think of it that way. There's another issue that comes up when we're talking about democracy, and that is the idea of a free society, right? Now, again, we make a claim that we are a free society, right? And democracies will make that claim, but there is a tension, right, in how a free society has to govern itself. Let me show you something that might help. So here we go. All right. So a little spectrum there, right? The idea of a free society in and of itself has a natural tension in it. And it's this, right? On one hand, we have this idea of being free, of freedom, right? As an individual, being free, right? So if you are truly free, you can do whatever you want, right? You can run around naked if you want to, right? But being part of a society means that society is going to place demands on you, right? There are rules that have to be followed, right? So if you were in a perfectly free state, if you look at the slide there, right? So I have this spectrum, and on one side is freedom, right? So if you are perfectly free, right, your personal freedom is at 100%, right? But those demands of society, those rules of society, don't exist, right? This would be equivalent to what a political philosopher like John Locke would call the state of nature, right? A time without government. Now, if you move down that spectrum to the other end, there you have society, right? And the idea of social order, right? And in that state, you would have really no personal freedom, and you would be under the demands of society. You'd just be like a clog in this great machine of society. You would have really no personal freedom. You would be told what to do and how to act and the rules that you had to follow, right? So there is a tension there, right? And that's why that's a spectrum, right? Because as you move down, as you move from one side to the other, you lose some of, if you're starting with freedom and you start to move towards society, you're going to start to lose some of your personal freedom, because again, you're going to have to give in to some of the demands of society, right? And if you start from society and you start moving towards freedom, you're going to have to lessen those social controls over you, right? And so living in a free society means that we're somewhere kind of in the middle there, right? We have to kind of balance this idea of both maintaining our freedoms, because those are very important to us, right? But at the same time, we have to at least allow some rules of society. Some of those societal demands will have to be met by us as well. But the point is kind of behind this, and why I like to show it this way on a spectrum, is that there is a natural tension there, right? Remember, one of the things about politics, a fundamental idea about politics, and particularly politics in a free society, is there's always this natural tension, right? And in many ways, we can never come to an absolute way to resolve those issues, which is one of the reasons why being in a democracy and being part of a democracy is always going to be a challenge, right? Because we're constantly facing issues in which we have to navigate our way through this. And that's difficult, right? That is a difficult thing to do. And I don't want anybody to think that it's not. Now, that said, you might say, well, why? This seems hard. And it is hard. But democracies do have a lot of value to them in different ways. People tend to be happier. They're more prosperous. I want to show you one example. This is what we call the democratic peace. So I have a chart here. Let me explain it to you. Basically, if you look at governments around the world, and this is something political scientists do, we talk about governments that are democratic and governments that are non-democratic. We call these autocracies for the most part, but that's just the cluster of all of the non-democratic governments that are out there. Now, what you can do is you can make a list of all the countries, and you can classify them as democracy and autocracy. And then you could go back and you could look at the frequency of interstate war. So one country going to war with another country, okay? And you can make a list of all the wars over all the years between different nations. And you can go back about 250 years, and you can make this list. And if you make this list, you'll find something very interesting. And it's this. When you look at that list, what you will see in the frequencies of war is autocracies go to war with other autocracies. They do it quite a lot. Okay. So that's the first line there. You will also see autocracies going to war with democracies. That does happen. Not as much, but it does happen. The one thing you won't see are democracies going to war with other democracies. It just doesn't happen. Now, again, you can't get into an argument when you're trying to code, trying to figure out if a country's really a democracy or not a democracy. So there is kind of a gray zone there that people will argue about. But outside of that, you just don't see democracies going to war with other democracies. There's kind of an argument about the War of 1812, but some scholars basically said that was just an extension of the American Revolution. So there are a couple of exceptions that might prove the rule. But democracies are just inherently more peaceful than autocracies. They get along with their neighbors well. Although when you do see democracies go to war with other autocracies, democracies tend to fight those wars much harder than autocracies fighting autocracies. So when democracies do decide to go to war, they really do go to war. So we can see that as well. But the point here is, at this point, is one, we've tried to define democracy, and again, it's a difficult thing to kind of nail down in an absolute sense. But at the same time, we know that there is great value in being democratic. So what I'd like to do now is I'd like to present 4 criteria or lenses that we can use to look at democracy, because democracy is a very multifaceted thing. So these are, and I have them up here on the slide for you. We're going to look at each one of them relatively quickly here. We have what we call procedural democracy. We have substantive democracy, institutional development, and the creation and maintenance of civil society. And those are all going to be kind of different ways that we need to look at democracy. Because again, since democracy is kind of this multifaceted thing, we have to look at it from these different angles to get kind of a full version and a good amount of data to decide, how democratic or less democratic any one government could be. So there is that. Let me jump back here. So let's talk about each of these very quickly, so we don't run out of time. First of all, we talk about democracy in a procedural sense, right? And again, this just means that your democracy is going to have those basic procedures that are necessary for all democracies, right? How basically that your government functions like a democracy. Now, again, in the most basic level, what we're basically looking at here is, do you allow for your people to participate in government? Now, again, there are different, this is where we get kind of different ideas of democracy. Now, again, we have the kind of the ancient form of democracy, which is a much more direct democracy. But in the modern sense, of course, in the modern world, when we talk about democracies, we're talking about indirect democracies, meaning that you're going to have some type of representation there. So we look to see if those functions are in place, right? So Do you have elections? Do you have institutions of government? Do you have a legal system that's meaningful? Those types of things. Now, again, procedural democracy is kind of the basic. In many ways, it's the line, right? If you don't have procedural democracy, then you really can't have anything else, right? But you have to be careful, though, like I said, because procedural democracy can be mimicked in many ways. Like, for example, the Soviet Union had a constitution and a legal system, right? So they had those things, but they weren't very meaningful. So we have to be careful when we're talking about democracy in this procedural sense. But that's kind of the first box we have to check off to make sure that we have kind of the basic foundations of democracy. So that's the first thing. The second issue is what we call substantive democracy, right? So this is the idea of having some meaning behind your procedures, right? And in many ways, we're not really just looking at procedures, we're looking more at policies. Because what we're looking at here is we're basically asking this question: are individuals or in groups within your society being treated in a fair or just manner, right? And that is the stuff of substantial democracy. Now that's a difficult question, okay? In many ways, questions of substantive democracy become much more difficult to see and decide on, because what you're doing basically is you're taking a normative idea, right? Is it a good policy? Is it a bad policy? Is it a just policy? So very subjective things, right? And you are then taking those normative ideas and you're using those as a basis to analyze government policy, right? So this becomes much more difficult. But again, just because it's difficult doesn't mean it's not important and you shouldn't do it. But it's always important to remember that this is more difficult than just kind of checking off boxes. So we have that. Again, in many ways, what we're basically looking at here and what we're doing is we're basically creating a rule for democracy, right? When you take procedural democracy and substantive democracy and you put them together, you basically get this rule, right? In a democracy, the majority rules, right? That's the basic decision-making pattern for a democracy, right? So we vote and majorities rule. But at the same time, not everyone's going to agree. And so minorities are going to arise from that, right? Now, again, when I say minority here, I'm not talking necessarily about a racial minority. And this would be a political minority. But again, it could include political minorities, racial minorities, ethnic minorities, other places, maybe religious minorities, right? But the point is this. Even though those minorities may not have won that election or get the policy that they want, they still have to be respected by the majority, right? And protected by them, right? So majorities rule, but minorities must be respected in any democracy. This issue was actually commented on by Alex de Tocqueville, the Frenchman who came to America in the 1820s and made observations about American society and government, and then went back to France and wrote the book Democracy in America, which is one of the best commentaries on the United States. So we have that, right? But again, without protections, without minority protections, what basically happens is your government then can become a predatory state, right? It can go after people, right, or groups, and that then creates situations where your government acts in a particularly non-democratic way. But again, non-democratic in terms of a substantial view of what democracy should be. So that's our second criteria. The third criteria is institutional development. Now, when we talk about an institution, we're basically talking about in a government in political institutions in this particular case. But again, those are entities that are going to be created within the society and have power to make decisions and authority to enforce them, right? So when we talk about institutions in the American sense, we're talking about things like the Congress, the court system, the presidency, right? Those would all be considered political institutions, right? But also too, in a more general sense, a constitution, political parties, any kind of legislative assembly, courts, those would all fall under the umbrella of an institution. What's important to remember about institutions is institutions matter in a democracy. We need political institutions because they create the mechanisms by which democracy will work, right? Now, again, this is important because we often talk about the idea of the rule of law, right? That's very important to us. This idea that we have a system that is limited by rules and by law, right? And the important thing to remember here is that's only possible when you have an institutional structure in which you can nest those rules, right? And so institutional development is important. Now, here's the thing about institutions, right? Institutions need to be well functioning, right? It's not just having an institution. You just don't have a Congress. It's got to have some power behind it. What a well functioning institution will look like, there's a couple basic things they need to do. Okay. First of all, an institution needs to meet the needs of its society, right? We design institutions to do certain things for us. And so that institution is going to have to do what it is set out to do, right? Also, too, second thing is that institution is going to have the power to penetrate into society. Because again, an institution that doesn't do anything is just, a debating club, right? So you have to have some power behind that institution so it can enforce its rule. And then third, society, everybody else, has to see the legitimacy of that institution, right? We have to agree that that institution is necessary and that the authority that it has is in place, and we can agree to it, right? Because again, getting back to this idea of, the societies are going to have some rules to them, right? Now, again, the problem, of course, is when institutions fail to meet that, right? Particularly if they lose legitimacy in a society, right? Then they become onerous and great resentment is built up against them. So we have that. But again, when you have strong institutions, your democracy can consolidate. So, you'll have a country like Norway, right? But if you have weak institutions, when those institutions function poorly, then your democracy starts to get into trouble, right? So we often look at the strength and weakness of institutions, because again, their institutions can develop, they can grow and become stronger, but they can also decay. So you can have um, a country that had strong institutions, but those institutions start to decay. When that happens, of course, you start to get in trouble. So it's always important to remember that. But the health of institutions are always going to be important when we're talking about democracy and how democracy works. The last thing, the last lens that we need to look at is the creation and maintenance of civil society. Now, this is a little bit different, but it's important. It's very important. The first three criteria kind of look at elements within the government, right? This, though, looks at elements outside of government, everything else, basically, okay? Civil society is all those organizations, groups that are not associated directly with government, okay? So think of things like schools, universities, professional associations, fraternal associations, um, cultural institutions, right? All of that stuff kind of out there, right? That's important to have that in place, because again, you need more than just government, right? You need to have a healthy and vital civil society out there, right? So you need everything else, right? Because that is what we do in our everyday life, right? That's what we interact with. That's how we interact and work with other members of our society, right? Through these different organizations. Again, this is very important, right? Because as Aristotle, the Greek philosopher, said, the one characteristic, well, actually, there were two characteristics of men, but he points out very early in his book, The Politics, that humans are sociable, right? That's one of our defining characteristics. We don't want to be alone, right? Aristotle actually says the only people who are happy being alone are equivalent to beasts or gods, right? Everybody else wants to live in a community, because living in a community makes everything else possible, right? Makes our lives possible, and the joy and happiness and productivity of our lives is defined by living in a community. So we have that, right? But civil society, besides satisfying our needs on an individual level, is also important because, remember, democratic behavior is like any behavior. It's learned, right? It's not instinctual, but we learn it. And the way that we learn it is by our activities, right? And so in a civil society, we learn to cooperate with others, to organize. And that teaches us how to do all of those things that ultimately will result in how we organize and govern ourselves. So what civil society does in a democracy is it teaches us how to be democratic citizens, right? Think about it. Social groups. If you're like in the Lions Club, right? There's a president and a vice president and a secretary and a treasurer, right? And you learn that, and you learn it from a very early age. Also, too, kind of going back to Aristotle. Aristotle said a good citizen is both a follower and a leader, right? Meaning that in some instances we follow others, but in other instances we are going to lead others, right? And again, this really gets to the idea of, it teaches us what it means to be a good leader, right? Because you don't want to be in a group that has a poor leader, right? So you learn to value what makes a good leader by being a follower. And then when you become a leader, right, you've already learned the basic principles of what a good leader does and doesn't do. So democratic society, or I should say civil society in a democracy, is important for that reason. Let me check our time here real quick. So that's going to be important, right? But remember, we need that civil society there, right? There's more than just government. And what we see in like autocracies is a distinctive lack of civil society. So that is our fourth and final criteria of looking at and measuring democracy. All right, we only have a couple minutes left, so a little bit about a couple conclusions I think that we should draw from this. And again, I know we went over things very quickly, and if you want to, of course, you can ask questions or you can talk to me outside of this. Love to hear from you. But a couple things, a couple of general conclusions that we should draw from this. Okay, first of all, democracy is hard, and we should never take it for granted. Right? It is a constant effort, right? Because democracy is basically a relationship, right? And like any relationship, it takes work. So we have to keep that in mind. Second, when we talk about democracy, we really do have to look at it from these different angles, these kind of four different angles. Now, again, other people might interpret these angles a little bit differently, but in general, kind of in the political science literature, this is something that most people will agree to. But the thing is you got to look at it from all those angles, because there are parts that you can only get to when you look at it in terms of procedure or substance or institutions or the health of civil society. But what that does is that creates a holistic view for us. And that holistic view is a much better view than just one or two of those things. But we have to have kind of that toolkit. Those are, those four things are analytical tools that we can use to look at democracy, right? But again, remember too, democracy is a work in progress, right? Democracies are always progressing, right? And sometimes there are pitfalls, and sometimes we have to be aware of those pitfalls. Democracy is really, it's not a condition, right? Or actually, democracy is a condition, and that condition will change from day to day, week to week, year to year. And many people kind of make the mistake of thinking democracy is like a destination. You get there and you're done, but you're not. And you constantly have to work at it, right? Which is kind of the last point. For democracies to prosper and to thrive, you're going to need both participation, and ultimately that requires citizens to participate. That's what democracy is. That is the secret to democracy, right? That people are allowed to participate. If they don't participate, then your democracy will lose one of its fundamental elements. And therefore, participation and engagement is constantly required for your democracy to remain healthy. Well, that is it for us in terms of the presentation. If anybody would like to ask a question over chat or anything, I'd be glad to take them now. If not, I don't see anything popping up. So if not, thank you all for being here. I appreciate it. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the sessions.